At Columbia as an undergraduate, I spent an awful lot of time taking literature and sort of high culture courses because I really thought the music department was terrible. And I took as little in the music department as I could get away with. They had one intelligent, interesting fellow teaching theory there named Bill Mitchell. But for the rest, it wasn't too good. And especially with my alleged composition teacher, who was Otto Luning, I just didn't get along at all. And there was a time when I went into Bill Mitchell and said, hey, I want to discontinue in Luning's seminar next term. How can I do that? And said Bill Mitchell, arrange a schedule conflict. And it was that sent me to the Friday afternoon at 2:15 Chaucer course. That was the course at which it turned out the other students, almost to a man, were the university basketball team. The reason being the same as mine. They needed a 2:15 Friday class. And so I guess I had one other non-basketball player who remarked to me once after class, he said, that population isn't much for scholarship, but it's great for height. That was very true. So yeah, with Luning, I recall one particular session that I found outrageous. He was sitting at the piano with a Mozart score up in front of him, and Otto Luning can no more play piano than I can play tuba. And he was poking at this thing, and it was just miserable. Here am I, a college kid. During my time in Cleveland as a raw youth, I had studied piano. I can think of 3 different excellent concert pianists with whom I had studied. I mean, I was used to hearing teacher go like wildfire on the keyboard. And here's Otto Luning trying to play Mozart, and it was not the most difficult Mozart, and just absolutely butchering it. And it went on and on and on. And I'm hoping for, once he says something, maybe we'll begin to really get the nuts and bolts here and get into something. And when he's gotten through, I think, to the double bar, he stops and he gestures some and looks up admiringly at nothing in particular. And he said, "Oh yes," he said, "this music, it's vast." And that really set me off. That's what he's going to get away with. So I started giving him the business. And after a bit, he said, Jim, says, you'll get yours someday. Says, not too distant future. You'll be teaching in a college, and you'll have a Jim Randall for a student. So I like that. that was where Otto Luning rose to the heights. He also seemed to be a good guy. I found out in later years that in fact he decided along the way, after I'd written some compositions and so forth, that I was okay, and he would get in there and sort of support me for this, that, or the other thing. But that kind of thing didn't impress me when I was about 18 years old. In retrospect, I had this same experience, which I'll mention, which is in print, but I'll mention it, about Vincent Persichetti. As I think back on the situation, I was even at that time a real hotshot for musical analysis. And you know, let's get in there and let's really tear this apart and get a hold of what makes this work. You know, so that some guy saying it's vast. This just struck me as the ultimate selling down the river of any kind of serious thought. Vincent Persichetti, I once gave the bird to at length in a book review because he had remarked that in modern harmony you could use any chord and you could do anything with it that you wanted. And that really teed me off because I was very much involved in working up pitch systems to replace tonality, and I mean, I was really into it, and that kind of thing, that you can take anything and do anything you want. Except in retrospect, I realized that that was, in some other context, would have been an excellent thing to say. That yes, of course, go take this and do anything you like. That would be fine. Not at that time. That didn't strike me as fine. And similarly with Otto Luning, I realized he was sitting there talking to composition students who surely identified him even back then as, you know, Mr. Innovator of electronic noises, Otto Luning, and they figured, you know, that that's where this is the future that's in there. So for Otto to sit there saying, hey, guys, Mozart, and then to say, you know, in admiration, and that I can't even tell you anything about it, it's vast, not bad. I mean, not a bad thing to inflict on the students. But he didn't get away with it with Jim Randall. Yes, at Harvard, I believe I'm right that Randall Thompson was functioning as the chairman of the department, whereby hangs another tale. But at the beginning of the year, I had basically wanted to go to Harvard after I finished at Columbia because Walter Piston, well, I guess two things. Walter Piston was there, and that sounded okay, that should be interesting. And also they offered an MA in 1 year. And at the time, I still had the idea that, hey, I want to get out of being in school, and I want to start teaching in school. And if I get, hey, MA from Harvard, you know, that I can. It wasn't true. I mean, back at that time, any more than now, was an MA advanced enough to count as a union card for teaching. But anyway, I was hoping it would. So I went up to Harvard enthusiastically, discovered Walter Piston would be on leave that year. So I asked Randall Thompson, well, you know, so what you got to offer? And he said, well, our most popular instructor in composition is a composer who I later knew of when he was on the West Coast, Paul Desmarais. And I said, okay, he's the most popular. I said, give me the other one. The other one was Bob Maves. Fine, I never heard of him. Serious composer. I believe he, subsequent to being at Harvard, spent a long time up at Rutgers as their composer up there. And so I studied with Robert Maves on the grounds that the other guy was more popular, which tells you what I was like and how it might be awkward to get along with me. And for Maves, again, I was working on one of my heavy pitch construction pieces. I remember, it was violin and piano sonata, and it was in particular a movement where the whole thing was variations on these pitch configurations that I invented and derived and did the business with. And I'd go in faithfully to Bob Mays each week. He's a very pleasant fellow. And after many weeks that I had been bringing this piece into him, it was pretty near done. And he said, "Now, Jim," he says, "it's time to ask you this. Have you ever considered what's really going on in this piece harmonically?" And I said, "Well, yeah, Bob, I mean, that's what it's all about. That's what I've been specifically attending to and working on." He said, No. He says, "I don't mean that. I mean, for example, take the first page here. Now, I notice that it has sort of a subdominant feel. And you can imagine who was the next speaker, and I forget what the hell I said, but that sort of did it for me. And also gives you an idea of what life was like at the intellectual level of musical composition back in those days. When I told my mother, who I'll have more to say about, my mother was a violinist and especially a violin teacher. And when I told her that, I'm figuring to go to Princeton because of this fellow Milton Babbitt, she checked him out with an old boyfriend of hers, namely Quincy Porter, the composer, who by then was a fixture at Yale. And I don't know. My mother had played either with him or with his wife in a quartet earlier in life. Forget his name. She called Quincy and said, "Oh, hey, Quincy, my genius boy is going to go study at Princeton with Milton Babbitt." And Quincy Porter said, this is as she reported it to me, Quincy said, "Well, Margaret, yes, he's a very bright boy, but, in music, intelligence isn't enough." And then at that point, I added the Randall corollary to that. In fact, it seems to be a disqualification. And that was the way I felt about things in those days. I have a few others about Randall Thompson, always worth mentioning. Randall Thompson, by the time I was at Harvard, which was already the early 50s, Randall Thompson was already sort of in the history books as a composer of a very decent symphony, I think it was, in E minor. And that counted, along with a couple of early Roy Harris symphonies, it counted as an American classic that proved that there were composers in America. And I encountered the piece within recent years. Nice piece, very well done. But by the time I was at Harvard, he had really given up any pass at what we thought of as modern music. And he had gone very much into the business of writing for amateur Christian choruses. He was a devout Christian and a notoriously anti-Semitic Christian. But he wrote pieces. I've even encountered one or two of his church pieces from his later years. Very nice. I mean, he knew what he was doing, writing that kind of stuff. And he had a seminar going on choral composition, I guess it was called. And each week we'd come in, and I forget what the deal was. Did we actually get together and sing each other's choruses? I don't know, we might have. And I remember a particular piece that I did. I think it was on the text, "Sheep may safely graze." I know I did use that text, and I didn't ever stop to think, or maybe I stopped to think, that this has for me associations with Bach. I don't know if that's even right. But in any case, it had for me a sort of religious connection. And I figured, I'm going to take this. We'll just make it "sheep safely grazing." And especially, I was interested in fracturing the text and taking the syllables and doing this, that, and the other thing. Not stopping to think that a devout Christian, an anti-modern music devout Christian, might look askance at this. So when I finally went in with it to Randall Thompson, he said, he says, "Jim, this isn't good." He said, "This text," he says, "the way you're setting it just totally distorts it." And again, as usual, I said, "Well, yeah, that is indeed what I'm up to." And I said, "But I'm surprised that would particularly bother you about it." I said, consider your average Kyrie. I mean, the text is just chopped and elongated and whatnot. And he's beginning to look a little irritated. And he says, "Jim, that's not distortion. That's a glorious interpretation." And that was my composition study with Randall Thompson. And let's see, yes, I have another, I should connect it up. He, and it was the general agreement, I guess, of the music department at Harvard, they'd had enough of me. They gave me my MA and over and out. But the way they delivered me that announcement, that that was it, was Randall Thompson called me into his office towards the end of the term and sat down. How are you, Jim? Said, "Well, now this is Randall Thompson talking." He says, "Well, now tell me, Jim, what are your plans for next year?" To which I said, "I'm going to Princeton." And he turned absolutely gray, because of course he had thought that now the bloodletting would start when I was going to beg to please give me some more of this Harvard education. And furthermore, I don't think I even realized it at the time, during the war he had been at Princeton establishing bad smell as an anti-Semite. So I think when I said to him, "I'm going to Princeton," that just hit him multiply, more than I even intended, in the wrong way. Yep. So that was my education at Harvard, along with a famous professor of American Studies who offended me grossly. I attended some lectures of his because he had been highly recommended to me by people I took very seriously. But he appeared to be maybe a sort of Roger Sessions case, that there was a time when he was thinking, and this wasn't it. He was just in there. And one of the things he said about studying, as he was describing, every last thing that was written by people you never heard of in 1865 or whatever. I think somebody, not me, somebody brought up the point that, hey, there's great writing to study from this period. What in the world, why are you devoting all this attention to these guys? To which his answer was, "Until you've read all the shit, you don't know the period." That closes that out. That's the level of intellection that I encountered at Harvard, and it caused me to move on.
that just sort of prompted a question about your relationship to poetry, because definitely.
Hold it. Turn the camera on.
It's on.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Oh, I'm fast.
What, can I right away?
Yes, you can fire out it.
Yeah.
Okay.
My relation to poetry.
There is one further question in that I have an impression that you have a very specific idea how to perform poetry, how to read poetry.
Sure.
Because I've listened to some of the
Oh,
CDs,
sure.
and it's
Well,
very different from your regular
Right.
poet going boom, 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 boom.
Yes, I did develop
Right.
my way of reading. Of course, it was the Marianne Moore, the poem about the fish, is the particular one where I really went after it with somebody else's writing. But yes, my relation to poetry, I think of two things. When I was in junior high school and high school, I think I chased down more poetry than prose. And in fact, I to this day have kept all the books I bought. I really bought the collected works of about everybody you can think of writing in English, both Brits and Americans. And so, yes, I have the, I can't even remember names anymore, but I've still got on my shelves the poetry of X, Y, and Z. And I think that didn't continue, but it was true back then. And then I would maintain an interest for many years. I would go to a poetry reading, and the way you imitated reading poetry was what I encountered, and I got very ticked off that poets were willing to treat their own poetry that way. Like I had that reaction to recordings of T.S. Eliot reading his own poetry. It's just, how can he do that to what he has written? And then, of course, we get to James Joyce doing Anna Plurabelle, Livia Plurabelle, and that just sort of confirmed me in the point that, hey, if you want to get serious about projecting written words, you can do it. But come on, you have to do something. And I guess, everybody thinks of that Joyce reading not only as a great reading, but as something that sort of corrects your view as to what the hell James Joyce's writing could be like. You have to realize that he's writing Irish, and he's always thinking Irish. Well, and I remember a poetry reading by beat poets that we had here at Princeton once, and I think Ginsberg was up there, I think there was another one named Gregory Corso. He was up there doing some reading, and it was like poetry exercise in high school English class. I mean, just dab da dab da dab da dab 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 da dab da dab, like that. And I remember being very indignant. I said those guys should hire me as a coach, because what they're reading, they should in the first place be reading off of toilet paper, not off of something like this, and it should trail all the way around, and they should clearly be speaking in almost a contemptuous throwaway style, not formal like for your English teacher reciting your poem. So yeah, I get all worked up about what it was that people were doing with poetry. Hey, and Dorota, you told me that one of your great readings of your poetry on an open space disc, where you got two things you read, and you claimed that in the first one you had listened to my Marianne Moore.
Yes.
And that had given you an
It
idea what to do.
definitely inspired me.
Let me tell you, that is so good. And in fact, I get right with it as you're doing this. That's particularly useful to me because with your poetry off the page, just reading by myself, it's not coming at me right. It's a little bit like James Joyce coming at you like a stock report or something, instead of like this wise guy talking Irish. So yeah, I mean, I got very interested in what you do with poetry. Okay, there. That's a round.
I mean, I think we'll talk about your writing. I don't know if you want to go into it now
Not
or
yet.
a little later.
Little later.
Okay, but that
For
was
some
just
for some reason, dirty stories and just sort of idle. Like it occurs to me that maybe I'm ready to. Let's see if I can modulate here. These 3 sheets have a general heading: positives. the one we just finished off is known as negatives. So,
you were very moderate. Your negative was very mild.
hey, that's partly because one thing that I think I will do a lot of is speaking as an old man now of this impossible young guy traveling under the same name, you know, and that's fun too on its own. Let's see what. Yes, let me talk a little about composing. Because I was very interested in doing composing at a relatively young age. I mean, I suppose at least by when I was in grade school, I would write down things on staves and poke it out at the piano, or I'd have things I think that I would inflict on my mother, play on the violin. And what I noticed thinking back to those times of like then and on into junior high school as I was working at composition and developing as a pianist. I had very good piano teachers. I have one in particular that I want to talk about. Thinking back on it, I can notice what a funny social and psychological position composition was in for me in Cleveland, Ohio. This is before World War II. In the first place, coming down my line of classical music by way of the Institute of Music, and my mother, who was a violin teacher, and my father, who was in fact an editorial writer for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, because he had decided when he came out of the country to Cleveland with his fiddle that in the big city they played in tune, and that was not for him. So he went into other lines. And in that context, composing was sort of a rare and indeterminate thing. Like what music was you played it. And it was there. I mean, you know, it's Mozart, Bach, or whatever. There's the music, and you play it. That what you're doing is writing some more that would go with that, or what. This was all very obscure intention here. But soon enough, in my life, it got well incorporated into the utterly competitive culture of classical music, where what you're trying to do is distinguish yourself from the others. You're trying to play better than anybody else around here. Yeah, you know, violinists, pianists, all the same thing. Contests, for heaven's sakes, to award you if you're the best, and all that kind of thing. And I can think back, and this becomes interesting in terms of what I did later in my life. I remember very clearly 3 people, I'll even give names here, they're probably no longer alive, my age. There was a real prodigy case, well known, getting what we call now homeschooling, and being raised from the cradle by his parents to be a music genius. And he was a composer. His name was Kenny Wolf. And I remember a young lady named Flora True Bowen. It was the same kind of thing. She was being pushed by her parents. In both those cases, talent was not what was the most obvious thing about these kids. It just wasn't. And I think of a third fellow, Danny Shapiro, who in fact was developing pretty well as a pianist, and his compositions were all reminiscences of Rachmaninoff. Okay, now, my relation to those people was purely competitive. My relation to them was hold them in contempt and persuade others of the same thing. Because, you know, you're trying to rise as they are. The last thing that would ever have occurred to me, like in high school, when I could have been old enough to think of it, was to call these people up and say, hey guys, why don't we get together? We could surely get support of all kinds from various directions. Why don't we get together and put on a concert of our compositions? Well, hell no. I mean, no such phone call would ever have taken place in those days. And that makes a nice reminiscence about what in the world the psychology and social standing of music was. And I think it was that sense of things that got me very much into a phase later on where I was principally doing 2-person sessions, unscripted, with me and one other person down in my cellar. But that maybe will be a somewhat larger story a little later. But I wanted to just put this background on there, just to show you what I grew up as. Okay, let's see. Oh, I should say that later on, when I was involved with founding the American Society of University Composers, my attitude, as you can maybe gather from that, where I'm thinking of composers collectively, and as maybe there being some issues that collectively they could deal with. I remember we were at a meeting of the something or other committee that I seem to have been on, when we were discussing publication of scores of compositions by some of the members of the society. And I remember very well there was a West Coast radical composer who had sort of a strong reputation as this guy's a real authentic, he's a real radical, none of this 12-tone bullshit. And his name was Barney Childs, and so he was sort of a known composer. Remember, we were sitting around, and one of my pieces was slated to be published in our next issue, and something or other came up, the problem about who this or what that, and so forth. And Barney Childs opined, said, look, everybody, let's just face facts here. Said, let's just admit that nobody is going to want to publish his music with us who can get it published by a regular publisher out there. And I remember even at that point being very struck by what a ridiculous ethic that was. That certainly fit in very nicely with my childhood views of what it was all about. But this guy was a grown man, and he was still hooked on that kind of attitude. I never had any doubt. In other words, there's no use asking me when I decided that I never had any doubt that, oh, music is, that's where I'm going. Now, I figured that along with that, I might very well develop as a great concert pianist, and also I think I was particularly hardworking as a first baseman, and any of those certainly appeared to me. Oh yeah, that'd be great to go those directions. But there was never any doubt that I would be in music, and that what that meant to me was first and foremost I would create it. In other words, I would be like Beethoven and Bach. I wouldn't be like Horowitz and Heifetz. Yeah, that just somehow was always clear to me. However, I would say that one person who certainly I still think of as engineering a real turnaround in my head was the pianist Leonard Shure, who came to the Cleveland Institute as a World War II replacement for Beryl Rubenstein and Arthur Lesser, well-known pianist. Arthur Lesser, well-known writer, wrote a fine book called Men, Women, and Pianos. They went off in uniform to fight World War II, and Leonard Shure, who was a student and an assistant, in fact, a teaching assistant of Arthur Schnabel. And for those that don't remember back that far, Schnabel was the great Beethoven person. And by way of Leonard Shure, I began to discover what that meant. I mean, among other things, I did specifically study some Beethoven sonatas. And study always means, of course, piano lessons, learning to play. Leonard just brought this kind of traditional high cultural German attitude towards this music. I mean, this was just perfectly comparable to some religious exercise. I mean, this was the sacred stuff. And now that took hold, and that's never left me. That seems to me, that's where I want to be at, and that's where it's at. That if you're not that way about music, it's a little obscure to me what you're doing, unless you're just sort of materializing the way I started. But with Leonard, that was the first time that I ever went into a lesson and played the first 3 notes and have somebody say, no, stop. Now, before you weren't ready to do that. Before you do that, think. And as a matter of fact, Leonard was a big help with my piano technique. My previous teachers had all emphasized the, of all things, curved fingers. That was very big in Cleveland at that time. I don't think that's much advocated anymore, really. Curved fingers and like this. Arthur Lesser was a true master of playing this way. Well, he got me. I never could play a fast note going at it this way. And Leonard just immediately loosened me up, and his approach is remarkable. He didn't have some other technical method beyond just sort of, to do it the way it comes naturally. And especially, you stop, think it, now play it. And it was amazing. Like, I became able to play fast notes. And it was because I would be thinking the musical phrase that those fast notes were in, and I would then wave the hand. I remember I quit recording my own stuff in my basement on piano when I started, oh, not that many years ago, getting somewhat arthritic in the knuckles and so forth, and just didn't have mobility or didn't have transmission from brain to fingernail anymore. And I remember really getting into a lather because I had a passage in my Gap first batch where I think it's just one place where it's supposed to go like that. Well, ever since I had studied with Leonard, I just think that, and I'd go and it was fine. No longer, like the digits were no longer responding quite so well, and I didn't have some backdrop of technical notion to do it. And that was the last time I recorded anything, because if by that method your hands are not totally the compliant servants of what you're imagining as the music, you get a lousy result. So anyway, that study with Leonard and sort of that transmission by Leonard of the Schnabel tradition of high seriousness in music. And by the way, there were only a few composers that counted as stuff you'd play. However, Leonard, in fact, was another, on a practical side, he did a great thing for me personally. He picked up and played a sonata that I wrote when I was a senior in high school. He played it, and he played it very well. He played it in New York and Boston, and I think in Cleveland. In New York, he played it in Carnegie Hall, which was very fortunate because that's what got me into Columbia as an undergraduate. We had an old family connection, which, that's the other 99% of it. Had a family connection. A fellow named John Kraut, he was a prominent historian who was, I don't know, the head of the graduate department or something or other, who was an old friend from Tiffin, was it? Tiffin, Ohio? An old friend of my family out in the wastes of Ohio, my mother's family. And he came to this concert that Leonard played at Carnegie Hall, which included my sonata, age 16. And I was there in a tuxedo and sitting up in a box to receive the plaudits of the multitude. I can even remember beforehand, it's amazing, backstage, I remember Leonard adjusting my bow tie for me. How a guy that's about to give a concert could be able to give a little attention to this dorky kid with his bow tie. I don't know, but that was Leonard. And that concert was reviewed by Arthur Berger. And we didn't pay any attention to Arthur Berger at that time because he just tore this pretension apart. But fortunately, somebody named Noel Strauss for the New York Times commented very favorably on this. Well, of course, at that moment, I had great grades in high school and all that, but at that moment, I was a target for Columbia University because their reputation at that time was they had the greatest trouble getting students from outside New York, and above that, getting students who weren't Jews. I mean, here am I, a goy boy from out there in the plains. It would have been better if I was from Kansas, but Ohio, that's not bad. That's pretty far out there. Yeah, so I mean, Leonard, in that sense, contributed directly to getting me into Columbia, and that meant 4 years in New York, which for somebody coming out of Cleveland was a revelation. And that was a great thing. Yes, I'm thinking back to when I was here at Princeton as a graduate student, and I came basically because I read some articles by Milton Babbitt, and I was just struck by the point that here is almost the first time that I ever read somebody writing about music who was clearly thinking from the ground up. This was not just mixing around usual musical terminology and attitudes, and especially assumptions. He was interested in taking it all on. And I was wised up to those articles by John Ward at Harvard University, musicologist there. And I think that was the only good thing he ever did for me. But when I got here, because of Milton, nevertheless, I studied composition with Roger Sessions because this was old style. When you were here at Princeton, you were here to study with Roger. Milton, Ed Cohn, Earl Kim, they did not teach composition. They did things, and I took plenty of their seminars and so forth, and in fact that's where the action was. But composition you studied only with Roger. And now I can recall very clearly that both Ed and Milton, who had been students of Roger's, I don't know, back somewhere around World War II, they spoke very highly of him. They had the greatest respect for him as a composer, and also, especially Ed, just all his life, referred to ideas that he got from Sessions. And so they regarded Sessions as a very stimulating and central teacher in their lives. Well, by the time I got here, and you only studied with Roger Sessions, Roger Sessions was a famous, legendary character because of the Copeland Sessions concerts of the late 20s. He was already in the textbook an institution of American composition, of which at the time there was little enough, but he was definitely always considered a central figure. So he could sit around here and draw a good paycheck, and he had lost all interest in teaching. He just very much wanted to be the great man. The arrangement was that we had to sit in a seminar with him for, I think it was 1 3-hour seminar in the week where the composers were in there, no one else allowed, with Roger. And it was excruciating. The students would get together to try to think up something they could propose to him to get something happening. But, you know, it was hopeless. And in addition, one was supposed to go over to his house once a week for a composition lesson. Well, I avoided that for many, many weeks, and I was working on a piece, and so finally I had enough where I decided, okay, you know, I have to go over. And you'd walk in across his lawn into a sort of greenhousey looking annex to his house. It was beautiful, you know, just the sun coming in on the grand piano, and he would have his composing set up on his desk with his transparent paper and India ink on which he alleged he composed directly, and I expressed wonder that he could do this, to which his reply was, well, you see, I know what I want. And he did. So anyway, I got there for a lesson about this piece I was working on, which I don't think the piece ever saw the light of day. It obviously had a certain number of staves on it, and so I presume it was for some kind of instrumental combination. And Roger took it and sat down at the piano with it and occupied the piano bench. Roger was a terrible, thick-fingered pianist. I don't think he particularly claimed to be a pianist. But he did want to sit there and poke at this. And also, I should say, he was no sight reader. This was not Vincent Persichetti or something, who it's alleged could sit there with your new orchestral score and give a passing imitation of what you had at the piano. That was not Roger. The piece must have been, say, 5-7 minutes long, and for 15 or 20 minutes he was working his way through it, just stick fingering things. He had got the clefs all wrong. I mean, it was terrible, and in no way did it resemble any piece of music, never mind yours. It didn't have anything going for it. And this went on, and I mean, I was, of course, dying in my shoes there. But finally, he was done. And he turned to me and he said, well, says, I'll tell you, Jim. Says, how would you like a cup of real Italian coffee? And I said, great. And that's what we did. And that was my composition lesson. And it was very much in the spirit of things around here in those days.
Okay.
We are back on?
There we go.
We are
We're
back
back
on.
Yes, let me tell my favorite story about Milton Babbitt. This involves 4 of us at a famous local restaurant, died decades ago, but was very much in everybody's picture back then as just a fast food hangout. The place, it was a cafeteria, and on the inside it was designed roughly like a men's room. It really had white tiles all over the walls, and I believe I'm not wrong that it actually had a no loitering sign in it. And it had a legendary waitress who was a hatchet-faced old biddy right out of a John Garfield movie. The gal who'd serve you, slop some coffee on the table in front of you at the 3 a.m. diner in the middle of Kansas. That kind of waitress. We went over there frequently for lunch or for a mid-afternoon something or other. And it was not uncommon that on, probably it was a particular day of the week, that Milton, Don Martino, and I, along with our department secretary at the time, who was a very kind of highly wired middle-aged lady who was quite superstitious and easily shaken. The 4 of us, frequently enough, were the crew that was eating at a table in the vault, and then there was this one afternoon when we went over there, and Anne was the secretary. She was very nervous and quite shaken. Said she had something she had to show us, and that she could use our advice on. The us being me, Milton, Don. And so, we sat down, and so she finally got out her piece of paper, which was something that had been mailed to her or left where she would find it, or I forget which. It was a real scraggly looking scrap of paper with just miserable scribbles on it, but that you could make out. And what it was one of these chain letters where you're supposed to do whatever it is and then send the letter on to somewhere. And Anne was really shaken by this thing because it said that if she didn't perform adequately, God would take retribution. And she wanted to know what us guys thought she ought to do, because this really had her. So, you know, as Don and I are thinking, well, what can we say to calm? Don was, for example, a reprobate Catholic, so you know, he knew what to tell her. I'm an atheist from way back. I knew what to tell her. And Milton finally is the first to speak, and he says, Anne, says, I'm a little concerned about this. He says, I think that letter is probably from God. He said, it's just what I'd expect from the illiterate son of a bitch. And that that conveyed my theology and Milton's very well. And yeah, that rounds out that way. Isn't that a good story?
That's a great story because
Yeah.
I think it encapsulates Milton's personality.
Oh, certainly.
Just right.
Certainly. That's something you got to know. And I understand they didn't use that story in the film about Milton. I told it to them when they were here filming me and Paul.
Oh, yeah.
But I told them that story, but
It was
no, that should be preserved on the record.
yeah.
Let's see.